Okay, it's 6:01 and we're recording.
Well, then I'll start off. We welcome everybody today. Of course, this is the 54th annual MLK Week. And I think we should be proud that we've been honoring the life and legacy of Dr. King for 54 years. That's quite a number of years there. So we commend the people of Chattanooga and everybody joining us today. We want to focus on public education starting out of the gate. And we have joining us today, and we're very fortunate, Ms. Diane Ravitch, who is the founder of the Network for Public Education. She's an author and education historian, former assistant education secretary. I think she's up to 12 or 13 books now. I forget quite how many, but I know it's a dozen of them. And so, without further ado, we want to say thank you for joining us, Ms. Ravitch.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you to honor Dr. King and also to talk about what is happening in education. I think there's trouble in a lot of states, but Tennessee is one of the most important in terms of where the very far right wing has made tremendous advances, in part because of your governor, Governor Lee. He doesn't believe in public schools, and he wants to bring in vouchers and lots of charters. And we all know that he wanted to bring 50 charters from the Evangelical College, Hillsdale College, where they've adopted a curriculum developed in the first instance by the Trump administration. And because of that, the president of that college made some very unfortunate remarks about Tennessee teachers, saying that they were the dumbest in the state. And it seemed, and I credit Eric for this, Eric Atkins, who said, well, we thought they were discredited after that he made that stupid comment, but they're not. They're back, and they're spreading charter schools across the country. Now, I want to talk about the particular crisis right now, which is the privatization of public education. I have no doubt in my mind that Dr. King would not have favored this development. In fact, I am sure he would be out leading the picket line to support public schools. Public schools belong to the community. They belong to the public. They belong to all of us, and they are not allowed to discriminate. There are many laws that have been passed to protect the civil rights of children. So whether they have a disability, regardless of their religion, their race, or their whatever, they have to be admitted to their public school. That's simply the way it is. It's an open door. The move has been on now for many years to privatize public education, first of all through charter schools, and more recently through vouchers. I have to confess, I worked in the first Bush administration, and I've come a long way, because when the idea of charter schools first came along in the 1990s, early 1990s, late 1980s, I thought, well, that sounds like a promising idea. We all know the private sector does everything better. Well, it turns out 30 years have gone by, and we now know the private sector does not do things better. In fact, when it comes to schooling, they do things worse, because what they're interested in is having high test scores, and they will choose the students that they want, and they will push out the students they don't want. Public schools are not allowed to do that. And so we've seen some high-flying charter schools, but when you look closely, they have a very small proportion of kids with disabilities, and only the mildest disabilities, if they have any at all. They also have small numbers of children that are struggling because they don't accept them, or they push them out, and they're all back in the public school if they ever left. So what we've learned now over 30 years, and I have to say that I changed my views on all of this. And in 2010, I wrote a book called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. And at that point, I said, I have given up on charter schools. They're not better than public schools. In many cases, they're far worse. What we now know about charter schools, and this is almost 14 years since I wrote that book, is that many of them perform far worse than public schools. And many of them are led by people who are in it for the money. There have been scandals galore associated with charter schools. because many of the people who've gone into the charter business are in it to make money. They're for profit and they make a lot of money. They take the easiest to educate children, push out the ones who present any kind of problems, and they hire teachers who are in their first or second or third year, so that they may pay them the same salary as a public school teacher, but those teachers typically don't last very long, which saves costs. I mean, the thing about the private sector is it has two goals. One is to minimize cost and to have high performance, and all of those do not end up well for the children, because it means pushing out the kids that are going to cost them more, and pushing and excluding the kids who are going to be a problem for them. So Tennessee, I think, should know more about charters and their failure than almost any state, because when Secretary Arne Duncan in the Obama administration started something called Race to the Top, you may recall he had Tennessee won $500 million, and $100 million out of that $500 million was used to create something called the Achievement School District. And the people running it in Tennessee said, we're going to hire the best charter school leader in the country. And they did. They brought in a guy from Houston, Texas. And he said, I'm going to pick the lowest performing schools, almost all of which were in Memphis. And in 5 years, these schools will be among the highest performing in the state. Well, I think it was 3 years in, he had a heart attack and he quit. But by the end of 5 years, not one of those schools was among the highest performing in the state. In fact, they all had the same level of very low achievement that they had, and they were in the bottom 5 to 10% of schools in the state. So despite all this money that was poured in, having the schools taken over by charter operators did not make them any better. The charter operators were not seasoned educators. They were not the veteran teachers that you know and that are part of your community. They were in most cases young kids from Teach for America and others who came in with very little experience, but high expectations. And those expectations were not enough to make up for their lack of experience. Now, all over the country, there have been charter school scandals. In California, they had an online charter operation that literally stole over $200 million from the state of California by falsely padding its registration rolls. We've seen the same thing happen in online schools in Pennsylvania and Ohio and in other states. And the online schools, in addition to being huge profit makers, because after all, they don't have a facility, they don't have to have a custodian, there are all sorts of expenses they don't have that your local public school has. But what they do is they have the lowest performance in the state among all schools, charter schools or any other kind of schools. So what the people pushing school choice are doing is selling people a dream. Come to our school and all your problems will disappear. But it's not true. It's ridiculous. They don't get better outcomes unless they screen their students and kick out the ones they don't want. And that's a hoax. And of course, Governor Lee is behind that hoax. The other thing that he's been pushing is vouchers. And I'm hopeful that that ends up going nowhere. I wish that the people of Tennessee would rise up and say, we're not going to do this. We value our public schools. That's happened in some other states. In the state of Texas, which is a red state and probably just as red as Tennessee, the rural Republicans said, we're not going to allow vouchers in our community because we know our public schools and they're the biggest employer in our district. And we know our teachers. They're our friends and our neighbors, our aunts and our uncles and our cousins. And we're not going to bring in school choice to our small town. That'll destroy our public schools. And so the Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, this year said, I'm going to get vouchers through, or I'm not going to give a pay raise to any teacher. I'm not going to give any new money to public schools unless you give me vouchers. They said, no. This majority Republican legislature refused to do it. He said, well, I'm going to call special session after special session until you give me vouchers. He called 4 special sessions and he lost in every special session. After the 4th one, he finally gave it up for this term and he said, I'll be back. Well, why is he fighting so hard for vouchers? Let me tell you about vouchers. Let me go back a little in time because, as Eric mentioned, I'm a historian of education. Where did this demand for school choice come from? It really took off in 1954. What happened in 1954? There was the Brown decision that said that segregating schools by race was unconstitutional, and it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And that began the school choice movement. Suddenly, people throughout the South, white people throughout the South, formed white citizens councils. And those white citizens councils said, well, we can't allow our schools to be desegregated, so we have to have school choice. And they began pushing the legislature, which was being all white. They were quite open to these plans. They started pushing, first of all, for to set up publicly funded private schools. Today, we would call them charter schools. They were then known as segregation academies. And quite a lot of states across the South had these segregation academies, which were specifically meant to block the Brown decision. And then some other legislators said, well, we've got a better idea because we've been reading this University of Chicago economist, Milton Friedman, and he says that if we have vouchers, then everybody will go to the school of their choice. And if people want integrated schools, they'll go to integrated schools. If they want all white schools or all black schools, that's fine. We'll give them the money and they go where they want to go. Well, you know how that would have ended up. There would not have been a single integrated school or desegregated school anywhere in the South. But a lot of the Southern legislators thought this was a great idea, and they enacted legislation for vouchers so that kids could get a voucher and leave public school and go to religious schools and private schools. And the Supreme Court at that time stopped it because it was quite obviously a way to evade the Brown decision and the implications of the Brown decision, meaning this has to stop. Well, today we have a Supreme Court that's probably not going to stand in the way of vouchers. They already gave permission to 2 religious schools in Maine and said if the state is supporting, the state in Maine has for a very long time, like over a century, said you can send your kids to a private high school if there's no public school district, no public high school in your district. And so the Supreme Court said, well, if you're letting kids from some districts go to private high schools, you also have to support religious schools. So 2 religious schools got permission, not just permission, the state of Maine was ordered to support the tuition at these 2 evangelical private schools. Now, here's the trick in all of this. These 2 religious schools don't accept anyone unless they're members of their own religious group. So if you apply to go to their schools, and if you're not, I forget which religion they are, but it's some kind of evangelical Christian religion. If you're Catholic, they don't want you. If you're Jewish, they don't want you. If you're some other form of Protestant, they don't want you either. They certainly don't want any students who are LGBT. And so they practice discrimination openly. And the Supreme Court said that was okay because, you know, religious freedom. Well, that's the road we're heading down right now, which is there will eventually be a case that comes to the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court is asked, can the state of Tennessee, can the state of Florida, can the state of Arizona use public money to send kids to religious schools? And I'm afraid the Supreme Court may well say religious freedom demands that you pay for their education too. This will end the separation of church and state, and it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing because it has been part of our American history that when you mix up religion and government, you get into troubled waters. And the biggest problem is going to be, which we've already seen not only in Maine, but in states that have adopted vouchers everywhere. The religious schools that get vouchers are free to exclude anyone they want. They don't have to explain why. They can be all white. They can be all one religion. They can exclude kids with disabilities. The door is open to restoring all the discrimination that existed before the civil rights era. But it's actually even worse than that. There have now been more than 20 years of studies of vouchers. The first vouchers started in the early 1990s and really took off in the late 90s in Milwaukee and in Cleveland. And there have been many, many studies. And initially people thought they sold vouchers as we have to save poor kids from failing schools. Well, it turns out it didn't work that way. What has happened now, and we see the spread of vouchers, and there have been vouchers now in some states for 20 years, 15 years. So now we have a lot more studies. And what we have learned is most of the vouchers are being used by people whose children never attended public schools. In fact, most of the vouchers in states with universal vouchers, which is what the ideal is for their promoters, and that is let everybody have a voucher, regardless. No, it doesn't matter what their income is. It's not for poor kids. It's not for kids in failing schools. It's for everybody. Most of the vouchers are being claimed by wealthy parents whose kids never attended public schools. And this is true in every state that has vouchers. Most of them are going to kids who were already in private and religious schools. Now, the kids who leave public school and take a voucher and go to a religious school or a private school, they're not getting into the really good private schools. They're not getting into whatever the best schools in Tennessee are. They're getting into pop-up schools that were created just to get the voucher. And those schools are not very good schools. They don't have to have certified teachers. They don't have to have certified principals. And they don't have to meet state standards, and they don't have to take state tests. Well, what happens is that these kids who leave public schools and go to voucher schools has a catastrophic impact on their academic performance. And a great many of them leave the voucher school and come back to public school, and the teachers find that they're woefully behind. There is a very prominent voucher researcher named Joshua Cowan, who's at Michigan State University. And if you want to follow up on this, the spelling of his name is Joshua Cowen. Read what he has written in the past year or two, where he said, I've been studying vouchers for 20 years, and I have become adamantly opposed to them because they cause a learning loss to students worse than the learning loss of the pandemic. So you have what's supposedly an education reform that's actually an educational disaster. It's a disaster for the kids who take it. It eats up the education budget, and it takes money away from public schools that admit everybody and gives it to schools that are free to discriminate and have no accountability whatever. It's also a budget buster. I was just reading today an article from Indiana where they said about 10 or 12% of the kids in Indiana are using vouchers, but vouchers are now consuming a third of the education budget. Well, something's wrong with that, because that's money being transferred from low income and middle income people in Indiana to subsidize the education of children from well-to-do families who are in private schools and already were in religious schools. So what I urge you to do is don't be taken in by the hoax. Think about the words of Martin Luther King, who said, and I was just Googling this, Martin Luther King said that the purpose of education is to develop one's intelligence and critical thinking. And he has several definitions, but here's one of them that comes from a book called The Purpose of Education from the Martin Luther King Jr. Research Center at Stanford. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. Well, gosh, I can't think of a more appropriate comment than this one, because we live in a world of lies and hoaxes and phonies, and where very wealthy people are supporting this movement to privatize public schools. They're doing this very cynically, because if they can get enough money out of the public system will become the place where kids are tossed away, and the private system will be fully underwritten. And guess what? That's where their children go. That's where their friends' children go. That's where Governor Lee sends his children, and where probably the wealthiest families in Chattanooga and Memphis and Nashville will get a voucher if he ever can carry through his scheme to have universal vouchers like Florida and Arizona. So you're talking about, I think, a nefarious plot. It's been underway for some 25 to 30 years. It's funded by some of the wealthiest people in America, and they're not generally known as crusaders for civil rights. They're not known as people who support the ideals of Dr. King. I'm talking about the billionaire Betsy DeVos. I'm talking about the billionaire Koch family, that's Koch. I'm talking about the legislators who belong to the organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The American Legislative Exchange Council writes model legislation on how to get rid of the gun control, how to get rid of laws that protect the environment, how to cut taxes on the rich, how to eliminate unions. You could just go down the list of everything that Dr. King would have supported. And ALEC has gotten model legislation and handed it to your legislators in Tennessee, but also in states across the Midwest and the South, and said, go home and write in the name of your state and present this as legislation for your state, for Tennessee. So it's a hoax. School choice does not improve schooling and education for your children or for anyone's children. The schools that are elite schools do not take vouchers. The schools that are charter schools pick and choose their students. And if your kid has a disability, good luck finding a charter school or any voucher school that will accept your child. And I'm very concerned for the future of public education because I believe it's the bedrock of our democratic society. And our democracy is under tremendous strain these days because we have so many people in the Republican Party believing that Donald Trump won the last election, which I don't want to get into that, but I think it's ridiculous. And it's as big a hoax, an even bigger hoax than school choice, because you have to disbelieve what you saw with your own eyes on television 3 years ago and forget that President Trump tried to overturn the election because he lost. And we're going to have an election this November that decides whether we continue with a presidency that's trying to improve the condition of the American people, trying to improve the conditions of workers, trying to improve unions. I think unions are crucial. And I remember, as I'm sure you do, that when Dr. King was assassinated, he was in Memphis trying to help organize the sanitation workers who were being paid an outrageously low salary. And he was a great supporter of unions. And the people who are promoting school choice oppose unions. They do not have your interests at heart. So in closing, let me say that I hope you will learn more about these issues. Google the works of Joshua Cowan, who's written about vouchers. I will send to Eric Atkins a link to a speech by a wonderful African-American scholar named Gloria Ladson Billings. And Gloria Ladson Billings, who is now, I think, emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, spoke at our last conference at the Network for Public Education. She gave a brilliant speech, and she said that she remembered the days when public transit was wonderful, but then it became degraded, underfunded. And then she said she remembered the days when public health facilities were outstanding, but then they became underfunded and degraded. And then there was a time when public housing was open to all and it was integrated. Sorry, it wasn't integrated. There were white public housing projects and Black public housing projects, but then they became projects that had to be blown up because they were so poorly maintained. And she said, I knew they were going to come after public education next. I knew it. And in fact, that's what's happening. So let me close by saying that I want to pay tribute to Dr. King. I was a very close friend of Bayard Rustin, who was Dr. King's associate. And so I never had the opportunity to meet Dr. King, although I was in Washington, D.C. In 1963 when he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And so the closest I ever came to him was to be in a crowd of 250,000 people listening to his words of wisdom. And I think that school children across America should read his words, reread them, watch him on Google, watch his speeches. He was a powerful speaker. He was a brilliant man. And his words should lead us to the future. We must not turn back. We are at risk of turning back. We have more crazy people in this country than I ever thought we did. We have more stupid people in this country than I ever thought we did. And we must rely on the intelligence and the wisdom that we have inherited through Dr. King and take his advice to build a beautiful and loving society where each of us cares about the other. Thank you so much.
Yes, and Miss Diane, I know that the Network for Public Education has released a new report, The Sharp Right Turn. Is some of this information found in that
Yes.
report?
Yes, we have written a number of reports about charter school scandals. We track them every day. And almost every day, there's a charter school somewhere that just ups and closes in the middle of the school year and pushes the kids out into the street. Charter schools have an unfortunate habit of opening and closing. I think of them as daylilies, but they're not as pretty as daylilies. But you know, if they're not able to meet payroll, or if their staff decides that they want to unionize, that might be a reason to close the school, and that's happened many times. And there have also been numerous scandals where the leader of the charter school, somebody who's being paying an outrageous sum of money, whether they're for profit or nonprofit, you have to really look at the books. But there have been a number of financial scandals, too numerous to name, but the Network for Public Education does have a website where we keep track of the financial scandals in the schools that close in mid-year. And I'm sorry to say that the single biggest financial supporter for charter schools is, on the private side, the Walton Foundation, the owners of Walmart. Every member of the Walton family is a billionaire, and they love charter schools, and they've created many of them. But the single biggest funder is the federal government. And because there are people in Congress who support charter schools, we work every year, our Network for Public Education, to try to cut the funding for this program, but $400 million goes out every year to open new charter schools. So as fast as some of them close, that's how fast many new ones open. And the charters have also introduced a concept that I think should be really alien to public education, and that is the idea of a chain. So you have KIPP, which has, I don't know, 150, 200 schools. I mean, that's like Walmart. You know, we're accustomed to having grocery stores that are chains, but not public schools. I mean, your public school should be your neighborhood public school where you know the teachers, they know you, they know your children, they know the older children, they expect to meet your younger children, and they're part of your community. And unfortunately, we have these chains where the principals come and go, the teachers come and go, and it's all about the test scores.
And I know it's one more thing that's concerning me too. You know that they are assigning these letter grades to schools now, A through F, and I know that's causing quite a fuss because it's almost like you have to discredit the school and the students, just to get that letter grade.
Well, the whole idea of letter grading started with Jeb Bush, George W.'s younger brother, and he started this in Florida. And it's a really invalid way of measuring the value of a school. I mean, a school has so many moving parts, so many people, the principal, the teachers, the kids. What you're usually grading, or what the state is usually grading, is just test scores. And what test scores are grading is family income. If a school has many children who are low income, if a school has many children who don't speak English, if a school has many children who have disabilities, it will be a failing school. And seriously, almost every school that's failed, supposedly, or given an F grade, is a school that's had all of those issues and not had sufficient resources to help the kids who are in the school. And so you end up with A grades where the schools have no problems or very few problems, and D and F grades where the schools have a lot of problems and inadequate resources. You're really measuring public support for the schools and also the income level of the school when those letter grades are handed out. They are totally invalid. And if I were in Tennessee, I'd be yelling and screaming about the letter grades because they're completely fake. That's like saying if you have a low income, you must be an F person. If your school serves low income children, they must be F children. It's a stigma. It's a stigma that's being placed on schools. And that's not the purpose of schooling. The purpose of schooling is to raise people up, not to tear them down.
And I know there's one of our largest teachers union, J.C. Bowman. We thank you for being here because the teachers have been in a heck of a fight. with COVID and all this sort of things. And we just want to tell people just to keep the faith, keep up the fight, and learn information such as what the Network of Public Education is putting out. And I know you have a conference this summer too. Is that right?
Well, we had one in October in DC, and we didn't want to have one election year. So our next one's going to be in the spring of 25. But
What can we expect
we
next
have
from the
been,
network?
pardon?
So what can we expect next? I know that you do a blog about it weekly.
We endorse candidates. We have what's called a C3 and a C4, and the C4 has the power to endorse candidates. So we endorse pro-public education candidates for local school boards, state school boards, and also for Congress. Some states don't allow us to, or we have to pay money that we don't have. We're not a wealthy organization, but we have about 350,000 members, people who support our work. And we work with groups in Tennessee. We've worked very closely with the Pastors for Tennessee Children. There was a group, I don't know if it still exists, called the Mama Bears. We worked with them. And we also worked with the pastors groups in other states. The Pastors for Texas Children have been powerful allies, and they have said very strongly they don't want vouchers. They want to defend and protect and preserve their neighborhood schools, and they want to have more money for education. The fact is, very few states adequately fund schools. There should be smaller class sizes. There should be a curriculum where every child has the opportunity to develop their talents. You shouldn't have to go to a private school to study the full range of history and science and literature and the arts. And every child should have that opportunity to become the best they can be. And as Dr. King said, to become critical thinkers and to develop for their role in society in the best possible way. That's what schools should be about. And this attempt to measure them through the standardized test is actually fake, because the standardized tests have many flaws. They're inaccurate. I spent 7 years on the National Testing Board, which was, I was appointed by Bill Clinton. And what I found was a lot of questions that had two right answers. And if the kids were super smart and overthought it, they might get the wrong answer because they were too smart. So these questions, there's nothing standardized about them, except that they're scored by a computer. So I guess that's standardized, but the questions are not standardized. The answers are not standardized. And we're judging children based on their ability to interpret what was in somebody else's head. And I just think it's wrong. There's some questions where you could say, well, that has one right answer. But a lot of questions are matters of interpretation, and children's lives are being either rewarded or stigmatized based on this phony measure.
Well, and the formula, that's one of my pet peeves. Dr. Saunders, when he was doing the value added measure, was from Tennessee. He was up there, and it's a formula for breeding cattle. And I could just never get over that. How do you take a formula for breeding cattle and apply it to children?
Well, I know the work of Dr. William Sanders. I know he was at the University of Tennessee. And in my mind, it's been thoroughly discredited, because the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, he spent almost $1 billion investing in an experiment. And he gave a half a dozen districts the money to apply this value-added formula to teachers, to say, all right, let's see if we pay them based on test scores and we get rid of the ones who have low scores and pay more to those who get high scores, let's see what happens. Well, what happened was that the teachers who were assigned to weak classes quit teaching, and it didn't improve performance anywhere. And the report on it was nobody gained from this $1 billion. It was all a waste. So, there have been numerous tests of this, of the value added, and it's a failure. I think we should stop toying with our schools, honestly. I think we should hire good teachers. We should give them community support. We should pay them based on their experience, and not subject them to all these tests of what are the test scores of your children? Because as I said before, if you're teaching the children from well-to-do homes, you're going to get great test scores. And it's not because you're a better teacher. You'll have higher test scores than the one who's teaching the children who can't speak English. but that's not the point, is it? I mean, that's confusing two totally different subjects. The one who's teaching the kids who don't speak English and the one who's teaching the children with disabilities, those men and women are heroes. And they're not going to get good test scores because it's really hard. The kids are having a tough time. They need our help to be the best they can be. And they don't need to be stigmatized and told that their teacher's a failure and they're a failure because their test scores are not high enough. I think we have to, I've written now 3 books on the subject, but I think we have to get over our worship of test scores because these standardized tests are not that good. And I have in my last 3 books pointed out time after time, example after example, where the tests are just plain wrong and they're not a good measure.
And the school takeovers don't help either. I
Oh my
mean, the
God.
school district
The
was an
school,
abysmal failure in this state.
the
And,
school,
and anybody that thinks that it was, they had 4 executive directors in 4 years. Nobody wanted the job.
well, the school takers have been a disaster. I mean, we've these past 20 years have been very bad, ever since the passage of No Child Left Behind, because it inserted the federal government into a role that it never was supposed to have, which is to make one rule for everybody in the entire country. And it's caused this hostility towards public schools and setting up impossible measures. And the school takeovers have failed. They don't improve things. Houston, Texas was the last district to be taken over by the state. And it was because one school, one high school in the city of Houston had low scores for, I think it was 4 years in a row. Then the city, the entire school system, one of the biggest districts in the country, was taken over by the state of Texas. And, we'll see what happens. But there's a very good book on takeovers. I'm sort of struggling to remember the name of the writer. It escapes me at the moment, but it's probably called Takeover. It was published by Rutgers University Press. And he said the takeover of school districts is particularly harmful to minority groups because the school board, the elected school board, is the first step on the way to political power. And when the elected school board is dismissed and replaced by somebody the state chose who is not from that community, it shuts down the community's ability to create their local leadership. And many, many people have been denied the opportunity to become school board members, state legislators, city council members, and to be in that pipeline to eventually move on to a higher political office because of eliminating the first step in the ladder, which is running for elected school board. And it has no school district that I'm aware of has ever improved because of a state takeover. It's a very bad idea. So we've had a lot of bad ideas. And the good ideas are having smaller class sizes, making sure that all kids have access to the arts, opening medical clinics in schools so that all children get their vision checked and have their dental work cared for, and making sure that all the kids have access to a free breakfast and a free lunch. Now, that's the kind of thing that, unfortunately, a lot of red states that have had that proposal have vetoed it. They don't want a free breakfast. They don't want a free lunch. They'll turn down millions of dollars because they just don't want to do that for their kids. So there is a kind of an element of cruelty that I find very hard to understand in these decisions to do the wrong thing when the right thing is at your fingertips. And that is to make sure that children enter school ready to learn, well-fed, not hungry, not and healthy. And these are things that we adults are responsible for. You can't hold the kids responsible for it. And some kids have parents who need help, and they need a food pantry in the school. They need social workers to help them get on their feet. There are all kinds of things we could be doing that we're not doing, and we know we should be doing them. And they're not being done in Tennessee because you have a very bad guy as governor.
Yeah, one of my favorite books was Jonathan Caus's "Shame of the Nation" when he wrote about, some of that was a powerful book that
Yes.
Jonathan wrote on it. And I know you talk about prenatal care a lot too. A lot of people was like, well, why is she talking about prenatal care?
Yes, well, when I wrote a book, the second of this my 3-part trilogy was called Reign of Error, And in Reign of Error, I wrote it because a journalist said to me, well, your last book says all the things that they're doing wrong. And when are you going to say what they should be doing? So I said, okay, I'm going to write that book. And so Reign of Error was that book. And it has like the 17 or 18 steps that we should be doing in order to make things better. And number one was prenatal care, because when women are pregnant and they don't see a doctor, their children have a higher risk. They're at higher risk of having children with deficiencies because they weren't fed correctly, because they didn't have the right medical treatment when they needed it. And so it's very, very important to have medical care for pregnant women. And it turns out that I think it was the World Health Organization ranked nations by the quality of prenatal care. We were virtually at the bottom. I mean, we were down there with third world countries that don't have the wealth that we have. And the countries that were providing the best prenatal care were in Europe, places like Denmark and Finland and Norway. They understand that you have to take care of the whole child, not just academics, but you have to make sure that the mother is well and that the family is healthy and the child comes to school healthy and well fed. All of these things are almost like common sense, but we don't want to do things that are common sense.
Well, and the last thing I want to say, because I know we're closing, is that a lot of our teachers don't feel supported either, whether it's pay, whether it's a professional development, and many are just leaving the industry. And I'm fearful for, teachers actually wanting to go in the classroom now. Really, I am.
That's true. We have a very, very serious problem caused, I believe, by this last 20 years of placing so much emphasis on test scores, because it devalues the wisdom of teachers. I mean, we have a lot of teachers in this country who've been teaching for 15, 20, 25, 30 years. They're good teachers, and they're being judged by inaccurate and harmful measures, meaning test scores, and they want to be respected, and they're not getting the respect. They're working in a profession that's not well paid. And what we've seen over the past 15 years is that enrollments in teacher education programs have plummeted. Well, the pipeline is drying up. And what are we doing about it? Very little. I mean, there are very few states that have said, let's raise teacher salaries or we're not going to have any teachers. And of course, the voucher movement says that teachers don't need any training. They don't need any certification. They can just come right out of whatever job they were working in and start teaching. And people who don't have training and background are not likely to be good teachers. And our children deserve so much better. So the people who talk about improving education, reforming education, closing the achievement gaps, they're not serious unless they're also talking about raising the salaries of teachers, improving the job security of teachers so that they can't be fired by vindictive politicians, and also stopping all the hate talk. I mean, I don't have to tell you, I'm sure you've heard it, the hate talk that says that teachers are grooming students. They want students to be perverse. There's all this propaganda about the evils of public education, the failure of public education. None of that's true. Our public schools are doing really a great job under very, very difficult circumstances. And I guess the puzzle that always strikes me is that on one hand, people will say, we have the greatest nation in the world. Well, 90% of our people went to public schools. How do we get to be the greatest nation in the world if our schools are failing? It doesn't make any sense. The answer is that our schools are not failing, but our society is failing. We're failing to take care of our children. We're failing to protect our teachers against vile insults. And we're failing to build an education system that meets the needs of all of our children, which is what we should have. I was in Finland many years ago, and I was very impressed because the kids there get 3 free meals a day. They get free medical care. They're not subject to this testing grind. They don't actually face a standardized test until they reach 9th grade. And they do fine on international tests. Sometimes they're first, sometimes they're second, sometimes they're third. They don't care. Doesn't matter. They want their children to be happy. They want them to love what they're doing. And I think that's a great, great goal, is that children should love learning and want to continue doing it even when they're not assigned to do it.
Well, and Ms. Diane, I think that the work that you all doing at the Network of Public Education help keeps Dr. King's dream alive. It's not about black or white or young or old or rich or poor. It's about what's right and what's wrong. And so on behalf of the Unity Group and everybody here in Chattanooga, we thank you very much. And I'm just going to give you a round of applause.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I really want to say how honored I am to be speaking to you in Chattanooga, because I know you have a very tough road ahead of you. And I urge you to stay politically active and fight for what's right, because people have to get out and vote, and you have to get everybody you know out to vote. And that's the only way to change the direction of your city and your state in this country. Bring out everybody.
Bring out everybody. With
Okay.
that, we wish everybody a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.